Hello, and welcome to History by the Pint, the podcast series that discusses all things history and archaeology in the time it takes to drink a pint. My name is Alex Rosen, I'm a producer and writer, and with me is Chris Shevitsky, a lecturer and researcher in Rome. In this episode, we're going to be discussing the remarkable story of one of the most famous relics in the world, the Holy Crown of Thorns.
So, Alex, you've been over to France recently. Where did you go? What did you see? Why did you go?
Well, I went over there primarily to see a very famous and holy relic, which is housed in Notre Dame. And that relic is the Holy Crown of Thorns, the crown of thorns that was forced onto Christ's head during the Passion, during the crucifixion, that he wore on the cross and that was then preserved in Jerusalem after his death. And it was an incredible thing to see because the French bring it out the first Friday of every month for public veneration in Notre Dame. So you can go along and you can be part of this incredible ceremony that potentially has been going on for sort of 2,000 years in some form or another. And so the reliquary, which is stored in this axial chapel, is brought out by the clergy, and it's flanked by these Knights of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre, who are sort of dressed in this white cloak with red crosses. And after some words from the clergy, it's brought out in front of the crowd, and you can line up and pay your respects to it. And it's on show for veneration for about 2 hours, and the queue was out the door.
Did you do this? Did you?
I did, yeah. I participated in it. It was just very. I'm a great people watcher with these types of things, and I went along because I thought this is really a chance to be part of history and to witness and to see these things happening, and also to see the effect that such a powerful holy object has on people. And yeah, you only get a couple of seconds with the crown. There are two parallel queues. One person comes up and either touches it or kisses it, says a few words. Then the crown's moved to the other side, and the next person comes up and says their things. They're sort of moved by the clergy from side to side, these two parallel queues.
When you say someone comes up, touches it, obviously they're not touching the actual crown, are they? Is it a reliquary?
Yeah, so it's housed in this beautiful reliquary that's a crystal tube, essentially, that's got gold filigree decoration and some enamel portraits of the saints around it. And through the crystal reliquary, you can just see the brown remnants of what was the headband, a number of brown stems or of rushes that have been folded to form this headband. There's no thorns actually left on the Crown of Thorns. One of those sort of ironic things. The thorns have all been scattered over the years, so it is essentially just this rush-woven headband, like I said, that's housed within this crystal reliquary. You only get a couple of seconds to see it and venerate it before you're sort of moved on, but yeah, just seeing people coming up to it and coming away crying or smiling or in contemplation and just being part of the whole theatrics, I guess, of the veneration was really illuminating. And I'm so glad that I went and saw it. And obviously fantastic now that it is back in Notre Dame after this horrendous fire that they had. And to be honest, you couldn't really tell that the fire had happened. They've done such a fantastic job in the restoration. So yeah, a very, very special thing to be part of.
Obvious question. What's it doing in France?
Yeah, so
I mean, I'm not up on my Bible history, but I'm pretty certain that isn't precisely where it should be.
yeah, it certainly is a bit of a strange place to find, this premier relic from the Holy Land. And yeah, the reason that I went to Notre Dame to see the Crown of Thorns in person was because I've been recently researching the history of the relic. And it is an extraordinary story, really, and it takes us right back to its role in the creation of these relics, the importance of these relics in the Holy Land, and then it follows through Constantinople and then to Europe. So yeah, it's had this extraordinary journey. So the earliest references, I think the earliest one is about from the 5th century. So, with the Edict of Milan in 313, Christianity become legalized under Constantine, and quite soon after that we begin to hear about the relics of the Holy Land in Jerusalem that you can come to venerate. Helena, Constantine's mother, digs up, so the story goes, the true cross and some nails. Part of that true cross goes to Constantinople. The rest of the cross remains in what becomes the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built on the site of Christ's death and tomb. And so the Crown of Thorns sort of is listed with a number of these other famous Passion relics. But we're pretty certain that it's in Constantinople, at least by the 11th century. Sort of with war and turmoil in the Holy Land, with crusades and invasions and things like that, a lot of the relics are dispersed, as it were. And Constantinople, the home of the Byzantine emperors, the successors of Constantine, basically collect together an extraordinary assemblage of relics. And they're spread pretty much across the city. There's so many famous churches, so many famous relics. But we do know that the vast amount of the premier relics, the relics of Christ's Passion, are contained within the palace chapel, the chapel of the Virgin Mary of the Pharos, the Virgin Mary of the Lighthouse, so called because the chapel was located close to the lighthouse within the great palace. And this was a spectacular building. Sadly, nothing remains of it. All we have is a few descriptions in the ancient sources, but we know that it was certainly an incredibly opulent building. The interior was adorned with silver and gold and columns of exotic marble, and that there were fantastic golden mosaics. And yeah, this became a very famous pilgrimage site for the lucky few. So it was controlled essentially by the emperor, but the emperor could give permission to come and see his collection of relics that were very tied to his sort of religious authority in a way. The relics gave Constantinople this supernatural aura. It was called the God-guarded city. You know, the idea was that this was an extension of the Holy Land in some ways, that Christ was protecting his relics and Constantinople, the chosen successors, as it were. And so, with special permission, you could go and see this, loads of relics within the royal chapel, bits of the Holy Cross, the lance that stabbed Jesus in his side when he was on the cross, parts of his tomb, his burial shroud, and of course the Crown of Thorns as well, which we're told had the gift of incorruptibility from contact with Christ's head, so it still was green, was known to still blossom, and it was the first object that was venerated by pilgrims, which shows just how important it was.
So at the moment we're in Constantinople with it. How does it end up, though, in Paris?
Well, it ends up in Paris to do with one of the most turbulent events in Constantinople's history, and that was the sack of the city in 1204 by the Crusaders of the Fourth Crusade, which is a very sort of long and convoluted story, but in a nutshell, a new crusade is announced in 1198, I think it is, by the then Pope at the time, and there's the usual rallying call. Loads of knights from Northern Europe get together, and, this is a call to liberate the Holy Land from, the control of the infidel. And there's a lot of talk and a lot of bravado and propaganda, but sadly, not enough crusaders turn up at the mustering port of Venice to repay back the Venetians for building the fleet that's been specially commissioned to take them to the Holy Land. So the Crusaders are left slightly red-faced, the fact that they've made this promise to the Venetians to construct this huge fleet, but then they don't have the people to actually fill the ships. So they're sort of left in Venice waiting to either to get more people or to come to an agreement with the Venetians. And the Venetians turn this to their advantage, and they actually agree with the Crusaders that if they help them sort out this rebellious city of Zara on the Adriatic coast, that will go some way to sort of deferring the debt. So the Crusaders help the Venetians out. The Venetians join formally the Crusaders, as it were. So they take this rebellious city, Zara, and then they get this very interesting proposal from an exiled Byzantine prince called Alexius. He wants the Crusaders and Venetians to place him on the throne, and he makes this astronomical promise to them, which the Crusaders and Venetians accept. So they're diverted to Constantinople, and as good as their word, they do put Alexius on the throne, but he can't actually match the promise he's made, which makes the Crusaders very unhappy. And this, in the end, leads to them storming Constantinople, them breaching the walls. The first people who breached the walls in some 900 years, and they sack the city, and the relics, the holy relics of Constantinople, fall under their charge, basically.
So the relic comes back with with the Crusaders, with the Franks at that point, or what happens?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because, Constantinople, the premier city, loads of stuff to despoil, and we do hear, of the usual booty being taken by the soldiers and the rank and file. But it was the collection of relics that were, in some ways, the most valuable loot, the sacred plunder. And these were appropriated by the various clergy that came across with the Crusaders. However, the collection in the chapel within the royal palace pretty much stays where it is. It becomes then the property of Baldwin I, who was one of the Latin knights from Flanders, who was part of the crusade, who was chosen as the new emperor, Latin emperor. And he then takes control of all these relics. And they sort of symbolize, that transition of power between the Byzantine and the Latins. And it's the sort of key part in that dialogue of power. However, further down the line, about 40 years down the line, the Latin emperors find themselves increasingly in financial straits, and that's when they start to look at these relics as sort of financial commodities that can be sold to basically get them out of the economic straits that they're in. And yeah, to cut a long story short, the Crown of Thorns is promised to Louis IX of France for an astronomical fee. He pays something like 135,000 livres or Tournai pounds, which was like half the annual revenue from his royal properties, I think, an astronomical figure. At the time, it was sort of controlled by the Venetians because they'd given the Latin emperors a sort of large loan and kept the Crown of Thorns as security on that loan, so it had to be bought out from the Venetians. But then it makes its way to France, and there's this fantastic reception is organised by Louis IX. The Crown of Thorns, really the first premier holy relic to come to Paris, where Louis had his capital, and he stages this fantastic reception where he meets the Crown of Thorns in August 1239 outside of Paris, barefoot. And there's this fantastic moment where he, his brother and his mother sort of open the silver vessel that holds the gold reliquary. And we know the Archbishop of Sens, who writes this account about it, he says something like, inside the reliquary, they saw the Crown of Thorns. It was as if they had gazed upon the Saviour himself upon the cross. So it was really a very powerful moment for these very pious and devout members of the royal monarchy, as the Crown of Thorns was symbolically taken into the French royal court. So yeah, this extraordinary moment in the mid-13th century when the Crown of Thorns becomes part of the French monarchy's history and destiny.
It's quite extraordinary that you've got, on the one hand, a king willing to give away half of the income of the realm in order to acquire what physically is a bundle of twigs, but not spiritually.
Yeah,
and yet you've
yeah,
got,
yeah.
and yet obviously has enormous spiritual importance. On the other hand, though, you have the Byzantine emperor willing to sell the objects that on some level are meant to be key to protecting the city. And I suppose it tells you about the respective power or what people do when they are in trouble or when they're not in trouble and what you can afford to spend your money on or not. I don't know. But also, I suppose there's the bigger thing of it must symbolize on some level the passing of Constantinople into the Latin West, and if does it connect with any idea about revival of the Roman Empire in the West, or how the Byzantines they don't see themselves as Byzantines, do they? They see themselves as Romans, even though they're Greek speaking, and this transition of and there's a rival claim going all the way back, I suppose, to Charlemagne and in France about being an alternative Rome. Does it tie into that, or this transfer? There's something symbolic about the transfer of power from the old world into the new powerful kingdoms in the Latin West.
I think that's absolutely the case, and like you said with your point, it's that transition of power from one people to another, and certainly when it comes to Louis, the Latin Empire is struggled, it's on the way out, so he's coming along and he's staking a claim as France being the new promised land, and absolutely creating that link right the way back to Constantine and Helena, and these early rulers who were the first to gather these relics and were part of that story. And what's really, really interesting is once the crown comes into Paris, Louis then sets about building a chapel that is fitting for its home. And he essentially, in some ways, recreates the famous chapel that was in the Great Palace in Constantinople. He builds the Sainte-Chapelle, within his royal complex in the middle of the Seine. And he spends, again, a huge amount of money constructing this fantastically beautiful chapel, which is still there today, and you can still go there. And it's one of the most extraordinary medieval buildings in the world. And I was lucky enough to visit that during my trip to Paris. And it was my first time there, and you go up into the top chapel, which is quite small, but it is just encased in stained glass windows. Some 15 stained glass windows, very, very narrow, about 15 meters tall, completely cloak the walls of this chapel. And it's like being inside a sort of crystal reliquary. And the stories laid out in these stained glass windows is very interesting. You have all the standard stories from the Bible, Genesis and Exodus and the crucifixion. But then you have one of the windows which is all about the history of the Passion relics, and a number of the depictions in the stained glass windows show Louis and his brother and the court receiving the Crown of Thorns into France. So he's absolutely weaving this relic into the story of Christianity and linking it with the monarchy of the time.
So when does it? So it's when it's brought over. It's initially in the first chapter. When does it move to Notre Dame then?
So, yeah, I mean, again, part of the extraordinary story of the Crown of Thorns is that it stays in the chapel for a while, but of course, the tremendous upheaval that's seen in the 18th century with the French Revolution throws a difficult spin on things. That the monarchy, the possessions of the monarchy, the palaces and the chapels of the monarchy are looted systematically, and a lot of the treasures are dispersed. Luckily, the relics were transferred in 1789, I think, to Saint Denis, which is the Basilica of Saint Denis, which is the burial place of French monarchy, sort of just outside of Paris. So they were there, and they seem to have escaped being looted and destroyed. A number of other relics didn't survive during that time. And then it seems to be entrusted to a temporary art council in 1794. And essentially it spends the revolution in a cardboard box in the cabinet of medals in the what is now the National Library. So someone obviously realised it's important and sort of very, very carefully removed it from the turmoil that was happening on the streets. It's then restored to the church in the early 1800s. It's then put on show for veneration, and then it moves to Notre Dame, where it finds its home. But of course, the troubles in France aren't over by that point. That there's various, again, dramatic upheavals, political turmoil. The crown seems to, again, by someone's very careful planning, evades some of those problems and was taken to Normandy for part of that story. It's then brought back, reinstalled in Notre Dame. It's there during the Second World War, where thousands venerate it. And then it's still there when, in April 2019, Notre Dame sort of semi goes up in flames.
A quite remarkable survival, or was it's in a specially protected area that's fireproof? I don't know.
Yeah, there was a fantastic story that came out, after the fire had been put out and the ashes had settled. And that was that the firefighters rushing to put out the fire were also asked by the clergy and the people in Notre Dame to save the most precious relics, one being the tunic of Louis IX, who became a saint after his death, the other being, of course, the famous Crown of Thorns. But in the chaos of that moment and the emotion of the moment, the clergy of Notre Dame who were there trying to help the firefighters locate these objects basically forgot where it was. So we have firefighters going around looking behind tables and chairs and paintings on the walls. They find the Crown of Thorns, only to realise that it's a replica. Then a quick-thinking chap remembers seeing the sort of grey safe on the wall that initially he thought was sort of housing a transformer or something, and then it transpired that was the safe in which the Crown of Thorns was stored in. The combination couldn't be remembered, so they took an angle grinder to it, or about to take an angle grinder to it, when suddenly the poor clergyman there did remember the combination, and they managed to get it out. So that was a moment where it could have well have gone up in flames. So thanks to the bravery of these people, that they managed to rescue it from certain destruction.
So it's obviously had this interesting journey from Jerusalem, Constantinople, France, but a different church now in Notre Dame. Is there any suggestion that this is the the final point of the Crown of Thorns, or is there a possibility it's going to end up elsewhere, either when France gets into huge amounts of debt and there's somewhere else that wishes to purchase it,
Yeah, could happen.
or
Yeah.
repatriation? I don't quite know precisely how it'd be repatriated or where to, but I mean, is there any controversy that surrounds either its like where it is at the moment, or any thoughts that it might go elsewhere, or not? I don't know.
I don't, yeah, I don't know.
Sorry, that's a bit of
fancy
a
question.
yeah.
Who knows if this is the end of its story or not? But yeah, certainly for me, like I say, it was just being part of a ceremony where you suddenly get an appreciation for the importance of these artifacts to Christians. And growing up in England, in the Church of England, we've lost that connection with the importance of relics because of the Reformation, and these things were just thrown all out. And so our experience of the Christian faith is very different from elsewhere in Europe. And certainly for me, it was just a very interesting experience to be in the presence of this artifact that's been so carefully respected and revered, and obviously in the eyes of people today still has such importance and power. I think that was really interesting. I think sometimes as historians we can do a lot of reading and forget about the actual experience and emotions of people, but this certainly helped me get a better sense and an idea of why this relic is so important, and why it's known as the soul of France, because it really is something that people still feel as a great unifier.
It's quite nice that the artifact is used.
Yeah, it's not in a museum or something. It's still something that's being used. And so that was really, really thrilling. But yeah, well, okay, well, Chris, yeah, well, I hope that's been interesting. I mean, the relics.
Sounds like you had a good time in Paris.
Yeah, it was good fun. Yeah, I got there just before the heist at the Louvre, which is another story.
Are you trying to claim that it's not you? Is this?
Well, that footage hasn't come out yet, but we won't talk about that. But yeah, so I was lucky to see that before all that furore. But anyway, good stuff, Chris. Great catching up.
Yeah.
All the best, and
All
Chris.
right.
See you later.
See you later. Bye.
All right, cheers. Bye.